I still remember the clink of crystal glasses and the polished laughter that floated around my husband's parents' dining table that night. The room smelled of roasted lamb, rosemary, and wine. Yet for me, the scent was tainted, suffocating. It wasn't just a family dinner. It was an ambush I hadn't seen coming, and I was seated right at the center of it. The dining room was one of those spaces that seemed to demand silence. Golden chandeliers glowed overhead, their light bouncing off the mahogany table. 12 people sat around it, his parents, his siblings, cousins, and a few of their friends who happened to drop by. I knew better. Every seat was filled with someone who carried their approval, their smirks, their unspoken judgments. I sat to the left of my husband, trying to keep my hands steady as I cut into the lamb. My fork scraped the porcelain too loudly, and I felt heads turn in subtle disapproval. I smiled weakly, cheeks flushed. My husband's mother, Margaret, noticed. She was a tall woman with an elegant posture, the kind of person who wore pearls as if she was born with them around her neck. She glanced at me, then at the table, as if ready to pounce. "So," Margaret said suddenly, her voice slicing through the chatter. "Tell us, dear." "What is it you do again?" She knew perfectly well. She had asked me the same question a dozen times before, always in front of others, as if daring me to give an answer that would finally earn her respect. I swallowed. "I work with freelance clients, mostly helping small businesses with design and branding." The table went quiet for a beat, and then her lips curled. "Ah, yes, freelance, meaning unemployed." Laughter erupted from 2 cousins across the table. My stomach dropped. I forced a polite smile. "It's more than that. I manage my own clients and I've built a network." But her husband, Richard, cut me off. His booming voice carried authority, the kind that had once managed boardrooms and now ruled family gatherings. "Freelance, Margaret, means she does whatever she can to pass the time. She's not bringing in anything real, not like our son." Every pair of eyes slid to my husband. He adjusted his tie, looked uncomfortable, then muttered, "Dad, that's not—" Margaret's hand touched Richard's arm. "Don't scold him, he's just being honest." Heat climbed up my neck, my ears burning. I wanted to disappear under the table. My husband's parents had always been critical, but never had they struck with such cruelty in front of so many witnesses. Richard leaned back in his chair, satisfied with the blow. "Back in my day, a wife's worth was measured by her contribution to the household, be it raising the children properly, keeping the home pristine, or supporting her husband's career. These days, well, some of us settle for less." That word, less, stung like acid. A cousin across the table snickered. Someone else whispered, "So useless." Margaret caught the word and repeated it, this time louder so everyone could hear. "Useless. That's the word. You're charming, dear, but without a career or children, what exactly do you offer this family?" The world tilted for a moment. My fork clattered against the plate. I stared at the glass of red wine in front of me, willing the tears in my eyes not to spill. My throat felt like it was closing, but I forced myself to stay silent. I glanced at my husband, searching his face for rescue. He shifted uncomfortably, cleared his throat, and said, "Mom, that's not fair. She's trying." Trying. The word slammed into me harder than their insults. Not succeeding, not thriving, just trying. That was all he could manage to offer in my defense. Margaret's thin smile widened. "Of course she's trying. But effort without results is like a recipe without flour, just a mess on the counter." Another round of laughter. My hands clenched in my lap beneath the table, nails digging crescents into my skin. I wanted to scream, to throw the wine in her face, to demand my husband stand and defend me like the partner I thought he was. Instead, I sat still, heart hammering in my chest, face burning as if I had been branded. The rest of dinner blurred into a haze. Their conversations swirled around promotions, investments, vacations, subjects I couldn't even join without sounding small. My name was mentioned only when someone wanted to add a punchline. Do you think she'll ever land a real job? Maybe she's waiting for a miracle. At least she cooks well, I hope. Each comment was another knife. Dessert came, some perfectly plated creme brulee, but I couldn't taste a thing. I nodded and smiled where I had to, but inside I was collapsing. When we finally left, the night air hit me like a slap. Cold, sharp, freeing. My husband walked beside me, hands stuffed in his pockets, silent. I broke the quiet first. "Why didn't you say anything?" He sighed, eyes fixed on the pavement. "They didn't mean it like that." I stopped walking. "They called me useless in front of everyone, and you sat there." He winced, muttered something about not making a scene, but I wasn't listening anymore. My ears were still ringing with their laughter, my chest heavy with shame. In that moment, standing under the street lamp outside his parents' mansion, I made a vow I didn't even speak aloud. One day, they would choke on their own words. One day, I would make them see just how useless I was. For now, I swallowed the anger and let the silence stretch between us. But the promise burned inside me, hot and steady, like a coal waiting for the right gust of wind. That dinner wasn't just a humiliation. It was the spark. And sparks, once lit, always find a way to burn. My name is Claire Bennett. I'm 32 years old, and if there's one thing I've learned, it's that people confuse modesty for weakness. I didn't grow up with silver spoons or summer homes. I grew up with hand-me-downs and chipped plates, the kind that told their own history through scratches and cracks. My father was a mechanic who worked 12-hour days, sometimes longer, just to keep the lights on. My mother cleaned houses for families that looked a lot like my husband's, polished, wealthy, untouchable. They never complained about their work. They told me hard work was dignity, that a good reputation was worth more than a fortune. We weren't rich, but our home was filled with small lessons, that meals mattered more when shared, that pride was dangerous if it kept you from being kind, that no one was above anyone else. I carried those values with me, even when life led me into rooms where I didn't belong, like that dining table years later. By the time I was in my 20s, I had carved a path for myself. I wasn't climbing corporate ladders or boasting corner offices, but I had a skill: design. I saw patterns and beauty in the smallest things: a storefront sign, a wedding invitation, the way colors spoke to emotions. I built a small portfolio and started working freelance, mostly with small businesses in town. It wasn't glamorous, and the money wasn't steady, but it was mine. Every client I earned through effort and reputation, not family name. It was during this chapter of my life, busy, scraping together projects, carrying a quiet sense of independence, that I met Daniel. I wasn't looking for love at the time. Romance had always felt like a luxury, something other people prioritized while I focused on survival. But Daniel came into my life like a warm gust of wind, unexpected and impossible to ignore. We met at a cafe I used to work in on weekends, designing chalkboard menus in exchange for extra pay. He was sitting at a corner table, suit jacket draped on the chair beside him, papers spread out like a battlefield. His pen had leaked, and a faint blue stain marked his shirt cuff. He looked polished, yet human, imperfect in a way that drew me in. He asked me if the Wi-Fi password was really Bean Queen 92, and I laughed. That was the first time I heard his voice. Smooth, low, and surprisingly kind. We talked in stolen moments between my shifts, then exchanged numbers, then met for dinner that turned into a string of evenings where time vanished. With him, I felt seen. Not just as the daughter of a mechanic and a house cleaner, not just as the freelancer hustling to make rent, but as a woman worth listening to. He asked about my designs, encouraged me to show him my sketches, and told me my work had soul. No one had ever said that before. Falling in love with Daniel was easy. It felt like finally exhaling after years of holding my breath. He represented security, not just financial but emotional. He had a steadiness I craved, a calm against the chaos of my upbringing. But love, I would learn, doesn't come without shadows. The first time I met his parents, I should have known. Margaret greeted me with a smile so sharp it cut. She looked me over, my plain dress, my scuffed heels, and said, "You must be Claire. You're different than we expected." Richard shook my hand with the kind of grip that felt like a test. His eyes flicked to my car parked out front, an old sedan that coughed every time I turned the key, and I knew immediately what he thought of me. I told myself it was nerves, that parents just needed time. And when Daniel squeezed my hand under the dinner table that first night, I let myself believe him when he whispered, "They'll love you once they know you." But there were signs, small, easy to dismiss, yet unmistakable. Margaret constantly brought up Daniel's ex-girlfriend, Anna, a lawyer from a well-off family. "Anna always handled herself so gracefully at dinners," she would sigh, or, "Anna had such drive. She was headed for partnership before 30. Every mention was a comparison, though no one admitted it outright. Richard asked me once if I ever planned on getting a real career. He didn't mean it as a question. He meant it as a verdict. At birthdays and holidays, I noticed how their eyes slid past me, how conversations shifted to subjects I couldn't contribute to: stocks, inheritances, European vacations. If I mentioned a client I'd worked for, they nodded politely, then changed the subject. To them, my work wasn't work. It was a pastime, a distraction, certainly not a source of pride. Daniel defended me in small ways. A quick joke, a change of topic, a hand on my back when the silence grew too thick. But his defenses were never enough to erase the sting. Sometimes his silence spoke louder than their criticism. Still, I stayed hopeful. Because love has a way of making you forgive too much, too often. I told myself they didn't know me yet, that if I worked harder, proved myself, built something bigger, they would see me differently. When Daniel proposed, he did it in a quiet park at sunset. No audience, no grand gestures, just us, a ring, and the words, "You make me better, Claire." I said yes with my whole heart, believing him, believing us. For a time, I thought marriage would soften the edges with his parents, that the ring on my finger would finally make me family in their eyes. But marriage didn't bridge the gap. It widened it. Their approval dangled in front of me like a prize I could never win. Their smiles grew tighter, their words sharper. And though the warnings had been there from the beginning, I chose to silence them, because I wanted so badly to belong. Looking back now, I realize that was the first betrayal, not theirs, but mine. I betrayed myself by pretending not to see what was right in front of me. By thinking love could change people who didn't want to change. I was naive then. Hopeful. Desperate to believe the best in them. But hope can be a dangerous thing when placed in the wrong hands. And mine were already holding the match that would one day set everything on fire. Marriage, I quickly learned, doesn't just join two people. It welds families together, for better or for worse. And in my case, it meant stepping into a battlefield I hadn't prepared for. In the beginning, I tried to play the role they wanted. I cooked Sunday dinners, polished the silver Daniel's mother had loaned us, and kept the apartment spotless, believing appearances might win them over. But nothing I did was ever enough. If I cooked, Margaret would say, "It's edible, dear, but Anna always seasoned her lamb with rosemary." Daniel loved it that way. If I tried decorating our living room, Richard would glance around and murmur, "Looks cozy." But a real home deserves a professional touch. When I proudly showed them one of my latest design projects, A cafe logo that had drawn local praise. They didn't even look closely. Margaret just said, "Oh, that's nice. But have you considered getting certified in something real like law or finance? Something stable?" Each word chipped at me, slow and steady. They didn't scream or shout. They didn't have to. Their contempt was casual, practiced, served like a glass of wine with dinner. Daniel noticed but rarely intervened. Sometimes he would offer a weak, "Come on, Mom or Dad, leave her alone," but his tone never carried weight. Other times, he would simply sigh, squeeze my hand under the table, and whisper, "Just ignore them." But how do you ignore a storm when you're standing in the middle of it? The comparisons never stopped. Margaret and Richard had a small circle of wealthy acquaintances, and their daughters-in-law were paraded before me like gold standards. "Have you heard about Olivia?" Margaret would ask. "She just got promoted to senior vice president at her firm, 2 kids under 5 and still managing it all. Amazing woman." Or Richard boasting, "The Parkers' daughter-in-law just hosted a gala. Raised nearly $500,000 for charity. That's what a wife does. She elevates her family's name." Each story was chosen with precision, as if to highlight everything I wasn't. And then came the most painful comparison of all children, or rather, my lack of them. We had only been married a year when Margaret leaned across the dinner table one evening and asked, "So, when are you giving us a grandchild? You're not getting any younger, Claire." I nearly choked on my food. Daniel sputtered, "Mom." But the damage was done. Every visit after that seemed to circle back to the same theme. My body, my worth, reduced to a ticking clock they kept reminding me of. At first, I brushed it off, telling myself I didn't need to answer to anyone about when or if I had children. But their persistence dug into my confidence. Every time I walked into their home, I felt my stomach knot, bracing for the inevitable question. Daniel's silence hurt more than their words. He never told them to stop, never drew a line. Sometimes I even caught him agreeing, saying, "We're thinking about it," just to keep the peace. But his peace came at the cost of my dignity. It wasn't just dinners. Their interference bled into every corner of our lives. Margaret would stop by unannounced, inspecting my housekeeping like a drill sergeant. If the laundry basket was full, she'd cluck her tongue and say, "A real wife doesn't let chores pile up." Richard offered financial advice that was really just criticism. "Freelance income isn't stable, Claire. Don't you think it's time you looked for a job that matches Daniel's level? You wouldn't want people to think he married beneath him." Beneath him. That phrase replayed in my mind at night, poisoning even the quiet moments I tried to carve for myself. And then there were the public humiliations. At a neighbor's barbecue, Margaret introduced me as Daniel's wife, Claire. "She dabbles in art, I think, keeps herself busy." I wanted to scream, "I'm not dabbling, I'm working," but the words caught in my throat. At church one Sunday, Richard joked loudly to another couple that I had too much free time and that maybe I should learn golf like the other ladies. The laughter that followed wasn't cruel, but it echoed in my chest all the same. Bit by bit, I felt myself shrinking. My voice softened, my opinions withered. I stopped talking about my work altogether because why offer them more targets? But no matter how small I tried to make myself, it was never small enough. The breaking point came on a warm summer afternoon when Daniel's family planned a trip to the coast. Everyone was invited, siblings, cousins, even distant relatives. Everyone but me. I found out by accident, overhearing Daniel's sister mention the beach house reservations. When I asked Daniel about it, his face tightened. He fumbled for an explanation before admitting, "Mom thought you might not enjoy it. She didn't want you to feel out of place." Not invited, not included, not wanted. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't an oversight. It was a deliberate cut, a reminder that I was, in their eyes, dispensable. I remember sitting on the edge of our bed that night, staring at my hands. The silence between Daniel and me was thick, broken only when I finally whispered, "Why didn't you say no? Why didn't you refuse to go without me?" He looked away. "It's just easier this way." Easier, for him maybe. For them, certainly. But for me, it was a wound deeper than any insult. That was the moment something shifted. The humiliation I had endured for months crystallized into clarity. No amount of dinners cooked, no spotless home, no forced smile would ever win them over. I realized then that their contempt wasn't about what I did or didn't do. It was about control. They thrived on making me feel small, and Daniel, my partner, the man I loved, was too weak or too comfortable to stop them. That summer, sitting alone while they laughed by the sea, I decided I would no longer fight for a place at their table. If they saw me as useless, then one day I would make them see just how wrong they were. I didn't know yet how, but the seed of revenge had been planted. And it was growing quietly inside me, watered by every slight, every insult, every cruel laugh. The summer they left me behind for the beach house was the summer something hardened inside me. Grief turned into fuel. Shame shifted into determination. I was done begging for a seat at their table. For years, I had let them tell me who I was: lazy, useless, unambitious. But deep down, I knew better. I had always been good with numbers. In school, math had been my refuge. While others struggled through algebra, I saw patterns as clearly as constellations. I could look at a spreadsheet and find meaning in the chaos. My parents once joked that I was born with an adding machine in my head. But when I married into Daniel's family, that part of me had been dismissed, belittled, overshadowed. Margaret sneered when I mentioned taking courses online. Richard called it a distraction from my real duty, supporting Daniel's career. Even Daniel rolled his eyes once when he saw me bent over textbooks late at night. "You and your little hobbies," he said, half laughing. It stung, but I kept studying anyway. Quietly. Secretly. At first, it was just a finance certificate course online. I took it while Daniel slept, my laptop screen the only light in our dim living room. I devoured modules on investing, budgeting, and market analysis. The knowledge thrilled me. It wasn't just numbers, it was power. Soon after, I started freelancing in a new way. Not design this time, but consulting. Small businesses who couldn't afford big firms hired me to streamline budgets, cut waste, and plan for growth. Word spread. Within a year, I had a steady trickle of clients. They weren't glamorous contracts, but they paid. And more importantly, they proved I wasn't useless. I didn't tell Daniel at first. Why would I? He never believed in me. When he eventually found out, after I deposited my first real check, he laughed. "What is this, Claire? Play money? You're not going to get rich helping mom and pop shops with their books." I smiled. "Maybe not, but it's mine." That was the first time I said it aloud. Mine. It became my quiet mantra as the years passed. While Margaret criticized my cooking, I invested. While Richard mocked my dabbling, I reinvested profits into the stock market, into property shares, into things I studied for months before daring to risk a dime. While Daniel sat comfortably in the glow of his parents' approval, I worked quietly in the shadows, building something of my own. There were nights I cried into my pillow, exhausted from carrying the double weight of their contempt and my secret efforts. But the next morning, I'd sit down with my coffee, open my laptop, and keep going. Because every step forward was proof that I wasn't the failure they wanted me to be. My first major breakthrough came 5 years into the marriage. A bakery client I had helped restructure tripled their revenue. They recommended me to a cousin who ran a chain of cafes. That contract gave me enough money to buy a small property. Nothing fancy, just a fixer-upper on the edge of town. I rented it out, and for the first time, I had passive income flowing in. Daniel dismissed it as luck. Margaret sniffed that investing in real estate was too risky for someone without experience. But I didn't care anymore, because my bank account told me the truth, even when they refused to. Years rolled by, and so did my quiet victories. Another property. A portfolio of stocks. A consultancy that grew large enough to hire 2 part-time assistants. By my early 30s, I had a foundation of independence they couldn't touch. The irony was, they didn't even notice. They were too busy criticizing me to realize I was no longer dependent on their crumbs of approval. At family dinners, they still called me useless. Daniel still teased me about my projects. But behind their laughter, I held the knowledge of accounts, contracts, and deeds with my name on them. One evening, after another dinner where Margaret had sighed about how Anna was now a partner at her firm and a mother of 3, Daniel turned to me on the drive home and said, "You really should think about doing more with your life, Claire. You don't want people to keep thinking you're wasting your potential." I stared at him, the streetlights flickering across his face, and felt a strange calm settle over me. "People don't know what I'm doing," I said softly. "But I do." He shrugged, not hearing me, not caring to, but that moment wasn't about him. It was about me. For the first time, I realized I didn't need his validation, or his parents' or anyone's. I had spent years trying to prove my worth to them, but in the process, I had proven it to myself. I had turned humiliation into fuel, rejection into resilience, and no amount of mocking laughter could erase the quiet empire I was building brick by brick. One night, I sat alone in my office, a spare room I had transformed into a workspace, and opened my financial statements. The numbers glowed on the screen, a testament to years of silent labor. Savings, investments, property income. It wasn't millions, not yet. But it was enough to know I could stand on my own 2 feet, no longer bound to anyone's mercy. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the balance, and felt something I hadn't felt in years, peace. Not the fragile peace that comes from keeping everyone else happy. Real peace. The kind that comes from knowing you could walk away tomorrow and still be whole. It hit me then, with startling clarity, I no longer needed their approval. I no longer needed to sit at their table, begging for scraps of kindness. I didn't even need Daniel, not really. All I needed was mine, my work, my future, my freedom. And that realization was the beginning of the end. Because once a woman knows she doesn't need you, she becomes someone you can never control again. For years, Margaret and Richard thrived on their reputation. Their home was a fortress of polished marble and oil paintings, their dinner parties glittering with laughter from bankers, lawyers, and society friends. To outsiders, they were untouchable, a couple whose wealth and influence secured them an aura of superiority. But even fortresses crumble. It began quietly, like a crack spreading through glass. Richard's company, once the crown jewel of his identity, started showing signs of strain. At first, it was whispered at dinners, a lost contract here, a dip in shares there. Margaret brushed it off with that dismissive wave of her hand, saying, "Every empire has its storms." But this was more than a storm. It was a collapse. One morning, I opened the business section of the paper and saw his company's name splashed across the front, investigation into fraudulent dealings underway. Words like embezzlement, unethical practices, and legal scrutiny blared in bold print. I remember sipping my coffee, the bitterness mingling with the sweetest taste of vindication. When I showed Daniel, he paled. "It's exaggerated," he muttered, scanning the article. "Dad will handle it, he always does." But Richard didn't handle it. Within months, lawsuits mounted, contracts dissolved, investors vanished. Their empire, once ironclad, began to rot from the inside out. And with it, their social standing. The same friends who once clinked glasses at their table now crossed the street to avoid them. Invitations stopped arriving. Margaret, who had prided herself on hosting the most elegant soirees, now found her phone silent. Even the women she once boasted about, the perfect daughters-in-law, stopped visiting, afraid their names would be tainted by association. The irony was almost poetic. These were the people who once looked at me and saw useless. They had mocked my small projects, my dabbling, my quiet efforts. Yet here I was, stable, growing, independent, while they were drowning in debt, clawing at the remnants of a reputation built on arrogance. At family gatherings, smaller now, stripped of outsiders, I saw the cracks in their armor. Richard's booming voice grew quieter, his shoulders stooped. Margaret's pearls no longer gleamed, they looked like a costume from another life. She still tried to hold her chin high, but I saw the tremor in her hands when she poured the wine. Daniel bore the weight of it, too. Their downfall was his shame, their humiliation his burden. For the first time, I saw uncertainty in his eyes, the kind of uncertainty that comes when the ground you've always stood on suddenly gives way. And then, inevitably, the moment came. It was late one evening when Daniel approached me. I was in my office, reviewing contracts for a new client when he hovered in the doorway. His tie was loosened, his face drawn. He looked like a boy instead of a man. "Claire," he began, his voice halting. "We might need your help." I closed my laptop slowly, savoring the words. "Help," he rubbed the back of his neck. "Dad's legal fees are piling up. They're selling the second house. And Mom, she's been so stressed. They think maybe you could contribute, just until things stabilize." For a heartbeat, I just stared at him, remembering every dinner, every insult, every time his parents' voices had sliced me open while he sat silent. "Contribute," I repeated softly, tasting the word. Daniel nodded, almost pleading. "You've been doing well with your little business, right? Maybe just a loan, they'd pay you back." My little business. The same business they dismissed, mocked, belittled. The same business they didn't even acknowledge existed. I felt something cold and sharp rise inside me, not cruelty, not hatred, but justice. The quiet, deliberate kind. I leaned back in my chair, folding my hands in my lap. "So let me get this straight. The same parents who called me useless now need my help," Daniel winced. "Claire, don't make this harder than it already is." But I wasn't making it harder. They had done that themselves. In that moment, I realized something profound. Revenge didn't have to be loud. It didn't need screaming or grand gestures. Sometimes revenge was silence, a calm refusal, the power of choice resting in your hands while others begged. I didn't answer Daniel that night. Instead, I let the request hang in the air, heavy and humiliating. Because I wanted him to feel what I had felt for years, the weight of being dismissed, the sting of being powerless. Over the following weeks, the desperation grew. Margaret called Daniel daily, her voice shrill, her words frantic. Richard's pride cracked so far that he showed up at our door once, eyes hollow, asking for a little liquidity. He tried to phrase it like a business deal, as though I wouldn't recognize the desperation in his tone. I said no, politely, calmly, with the same cold civility they had once shown me. "You'll land on your feet," I told him, echoing his own words from years ago when I had cried over losing a client. "After all, isn't that what successful people do?" His face crumpled in a way I will never forget. That was the day my revenge began to take shape, not through vengeance shouted, but through power reclaimed. For the first time, I saw them clearly, not titans, not gods, not untouchable elites, just two flawed people who had built their world on fragile pride. and now they were watching it collapse brick by brick. I never thought the day would come when Margaret and Richard Bennett would sit across from me, their voices stripped of superiority, their eyes heavy with shame. Yet there they were, at the same dining table where, years earlier, they had dissected me like I was some failed recipe or misbehaving child. The mahogany table gleamed under the chandelier, polished as always, but the air was different now. Gone was the hum of conversation from their social circle. Gone were the endless toasts to wealth and prestige. It was just us, me, Daniel, Margaret, and Richard, 4 people bound together by years of bitterness and silence. Richard cleared his throat first. His once booming voice was hoarse. "Claire, we need to talk." I folded my hands on the table, calm, composed. "By all means." "I'm listening." Margaret's pearls trembled against her collarbone as she leaned forward. "We wouldn't ask if it weren't serious. You know what's happened with the company. The lawyers, the debts, we're drowning." Drowning. The word lingered like incense in the air, sweetened by irony. Richard added quickly, "We know you've done well for yourself, better than we expected, and we need your help. A loan, perhaps, just enough to stabilize until things settle." My pulse stayed steady. Inside, I could hear echoes, Margaret's cold voice calling me different than we expected. Richard asking if I'd ever get a real career. Daniel sitting silent while they compared me to Anna. And now, the mighty were on their knees. I leaned back, letting the silence stretch. "Do you remember," I said softly, "the first dinner I had here, when you told me Anna seasoned her lamb better? Or when you told me freelancing wasn't a real career? Or how you mocked me for not being able to provide children on your timeline?" Margaret's face flushed. That was cruelty," I cut in, my voice sharp but controlled. "Year after year, you chipped away at me. You told me I was useless, forgettable, not enough. And now, here you sit, asking the woman you dismissed to save you." The shame in their faces was a kind of justice I could never have scripted. Richard dropped his gaze. Margaret twisted her napkin until it tore. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. "Claire, maybe just tell them what you're willing to do." I turned to him, my eyes steady. "Willing is the right word, Daniel, because I don't owe them anything. Not after what they did." Then I returned my gaze to his parents. "But I'll make you an offer, not out of pity. Not out of obligation, but because I want you to understand what it feels like to depend on someone you once looked down on." They looked up, startled, desperate. "You want help? Then here are my conditions." Margaret's voice trembled. "Anything." "One," I said, holding up a finger. "You will never again question the legitimacy of my work. Not in public, not in private. You will speak of it with respect or not at all." They nodded quickly. "Two, you will stop comparing me to Anna or anyone else. I am not her. I never was. And I don't need to be." Margaret's lips pressed tight, but she nodded. "And 3, I finished, you will remember this moment. You will remember that the woman you called useless is the one keeping you afloat, and you will never again confuse cruelty with strength." The room went quiet except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Richard's voice broke the silence, ragged with defeat. "Agreed," Margaret whispered. "Agreed." I nodded once, slowly. "Then I'll help you, but not with a blank check. I'll cover specific expenses, the legal fees for now, nothing more. You will cut your spending, sell your luxuries, and live like the rest of us for once. If you refuse, then you drown." It wasn't charity. It was control. For the first time, the power shifted entirely into my hands. I watched them swallow their pride, their eyes downcast. The same dining table that had once been a stage for my humiliation was now their courtroom of reckoning. Every word I spoke was a sentence, every condition a reminder that the hierarchy had inverted. When I stood to leave, I didn't feel triumph in the loud, victorious sense. My revenge wasn't about gloating. It was about balance restored. I walked past Margaret, who looked smaller than I'd ever seen her, and Richard, whose shoulders sagged under the weight of disgrace. At the door, I paused and looked back. "You were wrong about me," I said quietly. "And I will never forget that." Neither would they. As I stepped into the night, the cool air wrapped around me like freedom. Their shame lingered behind me, a shadow of their own making. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like the outsider at their table. I felt like the judge. The weeks that followed were quieter than I expected. No dramatic outbursts, no grand reconciliations, just the sound of pride being swallowed day after day. Margaret and Richard kept their distance. Their voices softened to something almost human when they spoke to me. They had learned the cost of cruelty, and I had no interest in teaching the lesson twice. What surprised me more was Daniel. At first, he seemed relieved that I had agreed to help. But as time passed, I saw the same pattern resurface: his reluctance to take a stand, his instinct to appease, his silence when words mattered most. The truth landed hard. Daniel had never truly been mine. He was theirs, bound by threads of loyalty woven long before I entered the picture. One night, after another argument where he urged me to just let things go, I looked at him across our living room and felt the weight lift. I realized I had been waiting for him to defend me, to choose me, to prove that I mattered as much as their approval. But waiting had stolen years of my life. So I stopped. Our marriage didn't end with shouting or betrayal. It ended with clarity. I packed my things, signed the papers, and walked away, not broken, not bitter, but free. Because by then, I had built a life no one could take from me. My business had grown beyond anything they could imagine. The small consulting gigs had become a respected firm with steady clients and loyal staff. I had properties under my name, investments that multiplied while I slept, a future carved by my own hands. The woman they once dismissed as useless had built her own foundation, stronger than the empire they had lost. Sometimes I think back to that first humiliating dinner, the taste of shame in my mouth, the sting of being compared to someone I would never be. It used to haunt me. Now it feels like a different lifetime, like watching a stranger stumble in the dark before finding her light. The truth is, their contempt shaped me more than their approval ever could have. Every insult sharpened my resolve. Every dismissal became fuel. Every door they slammed in my face pushed me to build my own. And when I did, I discovered something powerful. I didn't need them. I never had. My worth was never theirs to give, and it was never mine to beg for. Standing on my own now, I feel no urge for revenge beyond what has already been served. Their downfall was their own doing. My triumph was mine. Balance has been restored, not because I humiliated them, but because I rose above them. I have peace now. Not the fragile, conditional peace I once sought in their approval, but the kind that grows from resilience, from knowing you survived the fire and came out forged instead of burned. If anyone were to ask me today who I am, I wouldn't say Daniel's wife or Margaret and Richard's daughter-in-law. I would simply say, I am Claire Bennett, independent, strong, whole. The word useless once broke me. Now it only reminds me of how powerful I became without them. And that is justice enough. If this story struck a chord with you, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more stories of betrayal, revenge, and redemption. Tell me in the comments, have you ever been underestimated the way I was? How did you rise above it? Your voice matters here. Every story of survival, every story of strength, reminds us that no insult, no betrayal can define us. Until next time, remember, the best revenge isn't cruelty. It's building a life so powerful they can never break you again.